Welcome to the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show with Forbes author and contributor Dr. Josh Luke, America's Healthcare Affordability Authority. Visit drjoshluke.com for information on speaking appearances and other resources.
Dr. Josh Luke here with the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show, and it's my honor today to have somebody as a guest, Whitney Johnson, who's a social media influencer, author, and so many more things. You're going to find that out in the next few minutes. Whitney and I actually graduated, both of us graduated with our undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University, although we never crossed paths on campus because we were there about a year apart. But what I also love about Whitney, following her on social media, in addition to her great motivational shares and advice, is she's somebody, as I researched her, that she had a very diverse background like myself, that when she left college, she's done so many different things that led up to her writing this very powerful book. So Whitney, welcome to the show, and tell us a little bit about how you went from Provo, Utah to New York City to an author.
Okay, well, Josh, thank you for having me. My background very quickly is I studied music in college. And after I graduated, I had just gotten married, and my husband was getting his PhD at Columbia in New York. And so we took off to Manhattan. And when we first got there, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to do music, but I also knew that we needed to put food on the table. So I had to get a job. And my job was as a secretary, best job I could get as a music major. And as it may be kind of obvious, I'm a female. It was the late 80s. So I started working for a retail broker. It's working on Wall Street. It's a really exciting time to be there, and start to have this epiphany that I'm just as smart as the people who are opening up stock accounts. And so I start going to school at night, and eventually, studying not math, but statistics and finance and accounting, and eventually have a boss who allows me to jump from being a secretary to a professional. And
Right.
From there, I move up in investment banking. A few years later, when my boss gets fired, I take a step back. So I'm kind of disrupting myself. Take a step back to become an equity research analyst, which picks stocks. And I did that for about 8 years. And then had decided I needed to disrupt myself again. At this point, we had 2 children, and we were living at Boston at this point. I connected with Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School, and was working with him on a number of nonprofit projects that he wanted to start a fund to use disruptive innovation, this idea that a silly little thing takes over the world. And so we did that fund for about 5 years. And then in 2012, after really thinking about this theory of disruptive innovation, which we can talk more about in a minute, I realized it's not just about products, it's not just about services, it's not just about companies, but it's also about people. And so I disrupted myself, really wanted to chase down this idea, wrote the book, Disrupt Yourself, not surprisingly. And for the last 5 years have been really focusing on that. And now I speak and consult and coach in organizations around the world around this framework of personal disruption and how to manage through change and how to build high-performing teams.
Awesome. That's an awesome background. And so in addition to Disrupt Yourself, I know you also have a book called Build an A-Team. Right. Tell us which one was first and how they differ.
Yeah. So I wrote Disrupt Yourself. That was published in 2015. And that book came out because I'd had this idea that this framework wasn't just about products, it was about people. And I had seen that play out in my own life. I disrupted myself. I left Wall Street because I realized that in order for me to move forward, I would have to take a step back. And so I wanted to understand and wanted to create a framework so that when people are at the point where they know it's time for them to do something new, or they have the sense that it is, how do they do it? How do they do it effectively? And so that book is a 7-point framework of personal disruption, that allows you to pursue something new and do it quickly and effectively. After I wrote that book, I was having a lot of conversations with a lot of people, a lot of organizations, and they'd say, okay, I get that. Like, I get how to disrupt myself, but how do I do this inside of an organization? What does this mean for me as a leader? What does it mean for me as a boss? And more specifically, if I let my people read this, Disrupt Yourself, does that mean you're all going to leave? And I'm like, no, it doesn't. What I'm saying to you is that if you as an organization will allow your people to reinvent, to disrupt themselves, then they will not only be more engaged and therefore more productive. You as an organization will lower your we're about to be disrupted score. And so build an A-team. Well, Disrupt Yourself is for you as the individual, and build an A-team is for you as a manager, for you as a boss who's trying to be a person people want to work for, who's trying to build a high-performing team and create an organization that remains competitive.
I love that. Thank you for that explanation. That was really helpful. So again, on this show, we talk first about healthcare affordability in America, but also about social media growth and also about millennial culture. And I love, Whitney, talking to somebody like yourself that's a Gen Xer, but we had to step back and say, hey, millennial culture isn't a bad thing. In fact, I'm only doing a disservice to myself if I don't understand it. And I love being a champion for millennial culture when I'm not a millennial. And I sense in your social media and in the things I hear from you that you understood the same and had to step back and say, hey, you know, I have to understand the audience I'm speaking to at times. And I hear that in your communication. That's encouraging. But first, I want to get to, before we get to social media and millennial culture, I want to go over just for you. And I always ask this of my guest, and I know you have a couple children. Let's talk about healthcare affordability. And for my listeners, they know that part of the reason when Forbes asked me to write a book to teach American businesses about how to make healthcare affordable, and I said, hey, this isn't my sweet spot. I'm a hospital CEO who just kind of said, you know, that we need more transparency, kind of pulled the curtain back on hospitals. And they said, wait, that's why I want you to write this book, because people will listen. And what motivated me the next morning after they asked is when my wife said, don't you remember when you lost your job as a CEO and it was $1,400 to $2,000 a year to get Cobra? And you're like, I just can't do it. I can't justify it. And the point she made to me that I really love, and I share this often, is she goes, hey, we've been great stewards of what we've been blessed with financially. You've been a hospital CEO for 10 years. We've put money away. We've been responsible. And if we can't afford healthcare, who can? Like, you are the person to write this book. And in my brief conversation with Whitney about this for the show, she mentioned a similar story. So Whitney, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to share the story of when you were in a similar situation as it pertains to healthcare.
It's such a great question, because it's the kind of thing that we don't think about until we need to think about it. And you know, ever since I had graduated from college, I or my husband or both of us had been employed. My parents had always had insurance growing up. And so having healthcare was just something that was a given. Of course, if we were sick, we could go to the doctor, done. But a few years ago, when I had lost my job, I suddenly didn't have healthcare. I had Cobra, and that was going to be something that would allow or tend to our family's needs for about 18 months. But I knew that the clock was tick, 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 ticking. And so I did, for several years, have to go out and get insurance as a small business owner, which was fairly complicated, fairly expensive. It was doable, but it was it was affordable enough, but it was complicated to figure out how to do it, I would say, is the more perhaps even the bigger problem. Now, 2-3 years ago, my husband, he had been a stay-at-home dad. He's an academic. And so he is now, again, a professor at Southern Virginia University here in Virginia. And so we are now covered by my husband. But we did have that period of a number of years where we didn't, where healthcare was no longer a given. And it was definitely something that we had to think about and consider and budget for.
You know, hosting this show, I found that everybody has a story like that. About what year was that? Do you recall that you lost the job and had to make that Cobra decision?
Oh, it's been a few years ago. So not recently. Yeah.
Well, the point I wanted to make is it's the same exact situation today. You know, Cobra, you got 18 months worth, and then you're on your own. And a few years ago, my brother, who was a former ball player, called and said, what do you know about MediShare, these, you know, faith-based organizations that aren't regulated by the insurance? And I write all about these things in my book, actually. And as a small business owner today, I'm faced with that. I'm switching from one to the other. And it's amazing how little progress we've made in the last 10 or 15 years on this very difficult issue. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to put you on the spot a little bit, because I have 3 high school age kids. And as a public speaker on healthcare affordability, I often say, hey, when my kids get out of college in 8 years or so and come to me and say, Dad, I can't be covered on your plan anymore, they want this outrageous amount of money for healthcare, and I'm just not going to do it, assuming there's no mandate at that point in time. I've always said I don't have any response to argue with them when the current rates show that millennials and Gen Z are going to spend $1 of every $2 they earn in their lifetime on healthcare, on a broken healthcare system. So put you on the spot a little bit. How would you react if your kids came to you? And I think you have one in college and one soon to be. So how would you react if they came to you 5 years from now and said, hey, Mom, help me out with this? Like, where did this go wrong? And what advice can you give me on should I spend $1 of every $2 I earn on healthcare?
Josh, I have no idea. It's such a great question. And you know, the thing is, I mean, I'll do what I always do when confronted with that kind of problem is, okay, let's figure it out and find out what we're going to do. But it is, I guess the real difficulty is they say they don't want to spend the money, but do you really have an option? I suppose there are a number of people who say, okay, I just won't be insured. And I've known people who've done that, but that's not kinds of risk that I want to take. And so I think the more meta question here is you're asking me that and me saying, I have no idea, I have no answer. And
I don't either. So
quite revealing to me, something that I'm going to need to be thinking about in the next few years.
Well, good that I've planted a seed with you. And I think that takes us into the next topic that we love to talk about on this show, which is generational culture. And so let's talk about, you brought up a really good point. As Gen Xers, a couple things that happen growing up is, you know, in the 50s and 60s, there were more than 100 university programs nationwide on functional medicine, integrative medicine, what a lot of people, Hollywood loves to refer to as Eastern medicine. And the point I want to make here is a lot of those programs went away because Big Pharma wanted to convince us that if you're ill, you need a pill. And so as Gen Xers, you know, come along in the, you know, kind of being raised in the 70s and 80s, we were really brainwashed. If you're ill, you need a pill. And there wasn't this live healthy that the millennial cultures brought. And I think your answer is about your children and when that, you know, that millennial or Gen Z conversation comes with our children is they were raised in an era where there was more of a question mark there, and they don't see healthcare as mandatory like we did because they see that it's a broken system. So they're living healthier. One of the things I read about in the book is that there's a 1986 act, EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment Active Labor Act, that guarantees anybody who walks into an emergency room that healthcare is free to them. Well, excuse me, they get access to care and they can't ask about their insurance till later, which to some folks means free if they're not covered. So tell me about your feeling on, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit on this one, because I believe that before the Affordable Care Act, if you were to ask people this, it would have been a much different answer. But is healthcare, and not political, just is healthcare a right or is it a privilege? Because I think that conversation tone has changed so much in the last 10 years because it became accessible, right? So what are your thoughts on that? And have they changed in the last 10 years, I guess, is the question I have.
Wow. Okay. So this is a question that I literally have never asked myself before. So again, I think there's a meta question here. So I suppose I'm somewhere in between on that. Somewhere, you know, there's a continuum, I suppose. You know, there's a privilege and there's a right. And I do believe it is a privilege to be cared for by good nurses and doctors. I think that is a privilege that we have, and certainly in a developed market is something that most of us have. And maybe based on your research, that's not actually true. But I do feel like at some level, we all do deserve, so there is some level of a right to be cared for, that we as a society need to somehow make sure that the people around us are cared for and taken care of, certainly at some sort of basic level. But that's my off the top of my head answer. It is certainly not well thought. It comes more from a place of my values as opposed to me thinking through this from a more political standpoint.
And I think your answer is very consistent with how society has shifted. It wasn't a topic that we thought much about until the Affordable Care Act mandated care. And now we've had it accessible to us, and it's something the millennials for most of their life have always had access to. And so that perception shifting. So let's talk about something funner than that. Social media.
Well, this was kind of fun. I mean, you disrupted me. You got me thinking about something I don't usually think about.
That's right. Disrupting the holiday season. We're taping the show fourth quarter 2018. And so disrupting the thought process during holiday season. So Whitney's very active on Twitter at Johnson Whitney, and also on LinkedIn. Right. And as many of you know, I was one of the keynote speakers at the Masters of LinkedIn Summit, the first one last year in LA. And if you think I have a robust following with almost 40,000 followers, I noticed that Whitney has almost 1.5 million LinkedIn followers. And for those of you who have reached out to me for social media support, the first thing I always say on growth is, hey, it's a marathon and not a sprint. And the second thought I always say is, I'm more concerned with quality followers who are interested, A, in my message and my brand, but B, in purchasing what I'm bringing to the table to sell, whether value or whether services or products, because I need to feed my family, and social media is the method I've chosen to do it. So Whitney, what I wanted to ask you is to kind of address those things. This must have been a marathon for you. When did you start saying, hey, I am going to proactively engage in LinkedIn and Twitter? And are there any other platforms that you use? So tell us a little bit about kind of when you started and how you find value in social media.
Okay, fun. All right, so I first started in social media in 2006 and when I started blogging. So that was my first introduction to this world. I used TypePad, and I decided that I wanted to start a blog. And it was at that point I was writing a lot about how do you achieve your dreams. I had written a book called Dare, Dream, Do that came out actually in 2012, but that blog was really the lead up to me figuring out how to find my voice. And I found that having a social presence is a great way to figure out what you have to say and figure out who wants to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
So that was step number one. Then I think in 2008, 2009, maybe it was longer than that, but I don't think so. I think I've been on Twitter for quite a while. My first foray into actual social media was Twitter. So Johnson Whitney, but Whitney Johnson was already taken. So it couldn't have been that early, but it's definitely been 7 or 8 years, and really made a concerted effort to figure out what that platform looked like, how to have conversations. One of the things I liked about it early on, I had read a fellow, he was at the time at Salesforce. His name was JP Rangaswamy. And he said that social media and Twitter in particular was like pheromones, social pheromones. It allowed you to find people who were interested in what you had to say and help you find people who were interesting to you. And so that was really exciting to me, is how do you find a way to amplify your ideas, but also then find people that you want to interact with. I also did get on Facebook. Historically though, Facebook, the job that it has done for me in particular has been, help me stay in touch with people that I've known in other phases of my life, earlier in my life, high school and college, etc. Much more social, doing the job for me of not having to send Christmas cards, although I do miss having Christmas cards, so less of a business, but more of a social, really a social platform for me, social in the sense of personal social. LinkedIn, I've been on, 7 or 8 years, and had the good fortune several years ago to be selected as a LinkedIn influencer, which is where they had people that they wanted to hear what they had to say and were willing to put them on this platform where there was a bit more amplification of their ideas. And in fact, just a week ago or so, I was selected as one of the 20 significant influencers this year. So that was a big excitement.
Oh, awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
By LinkedIn? Exciting. Was that by LinkedIn?
Yeah, by LinkedIn. So that was a big exciting moment. So LinkedIn has been a great platform in terms of being able to connect with people in the workspace. And I would say at this point, even more so than Twitter, is an opportunity for me to connect with people around the ideas of disruption and of building high-performing teams. I'm also on Instagram, but less so. I tend to be more focused on the written word as opposed to being a photojournalist, although I do use Instagram some. But really at this point, my 2 platforms of choice are LinkedIn first, and secondarily on Twitter.
Awesome. And that's kind of my preference too, although I've started to put a lot more effort into Twitter. And so I was sharing with Whitney off air that I teach at the University of Southern California in their healthcare policy, their public policy department on healthcare policy. And a few years ago, I got invited to this social media thing. When I got there, I found out it was all USC employees, except for, I asked the lady next to me, hey, why are we here? Like, what is this? It was sponsored by Bloomberg. And she said, oh, we're all USC employees, but they invited like 5 or 6 people on campus who are heavily followed on social media. And I said, oh, I guess I'm one of those people because I'm not an employee, I'm adjunct faculty. And at that meeting, Instagram and Twitter were there, and the Twitter folks, and again, I was a big LinkedIn guy at the time, and I had Twitter, but it was more of just an afterthought. Yeah. And the gentleman from Twitter, who I still keep in touch with to this day, said something that really, I kind of had that same moment you did with the colleague from Salesforce you mentioned. He said, hey, we see ourselves as the #1 news agency in the world. And I raised my hand. I said, okay, hold on. I'm a journalism grad. I'm a huge follower and critic of the fact that I think, journalism is completely shifted, changing, all this debate that's going on in recent years, but explain yourself is basically what I said to him. And he said, hey, we have a reporter on site at every event that happens anywhere in the world at all times with a camera. And I kind of went, that's a little bit arrogant, but he's right. And between firsthand, us as users, information, and secondhand sharing a story, which I want to get to in a minute, because that's how I've found a lot of my growth, is by sharing other people's stories and putting my filter on in short form media. He convinced me that they are one of the top news sources in the world. So I went to my students that next week and I said, tell me the top 3 news sources you have. And there was only one newspaper mentioned from 22 students, and it was the Wall Street Journal. It was their #3 source. And that again gets back to that conversation.
#1 and #2?
They were a good question. I know that interests you. That's awesome. So Twitter was up there. Apple News was up there. And even just Twitter going to the microscope and seeing what's trending. And I have plenty of stories about when my wife says, oh, social media says this person died. I'll go, hold on. No, it's not trending on Twitter. That's fake news. I've done that with several times because my students taught me whatever's trending. So anyway, I had similar experiences with you and then I read a book by Rusty Shelton that's called Mastering the Social Media Landscape. And he very clearly outlined what the value of each platform was. And that was very helpful to me.
Yeah.
Of where and why you do things. And you brought up Instagram, and what works on Instagram, as I'm sure you know, Whitney, is particularly with millennials, they go to the picture first, and if it interests them, then they read the caption. So in any case, I've had very similar stories, and I think that's cool. I want to ask you, so you named your blog certainly brought you attention. LinkedIn bringing you recognition brought you attention. What on Twitter? How many followers do you have approximately on Twitter? Do you know?
I have around 70,000 followers on Twitter.
And what do you attribute that growth to? I mean, granted, 12 years, so of being active.
Yeah, I would say the longevity, being active. I mean, early on, probably, well, I don't know, early on, but 3 or 4 years ago, I did have some, I worked with a woman named Becky Robinson who helped me build out my Twitter account, like actively trying to build that out.
Yeah.
But I haven't done anything around that for probably 3 or 4 years. It's much more organic at this point.
Yeah, and I think organic is, in my opinion, ultimately, once you kind of establish that base, organically is the way you really want to grow, because those are people, I look at it as like subscribers, right? They're subscribing to your content. So, all right, I want to ask you a fun social media question. I have found that when somebody disagrees with me, and I always say to people, by the way, that's the whole point of putting good content out there, so people want to chime in and comment and offer differing opinions.
Yeah.
By pleasantly, okay, hating is one thing, I just delete that and move on.
Right.
But when somebody offers a differing opinion, a contrasting opinion in a respectful manner, I always thank them and say, hey, but here's kind of a counterpoint, but thank you, great point. I love what you're saying. Here's part of the reason I am rooted in where I am rooted in my position, but can you tell me more about why you sway this way? Great conversations come about. Tell me about your experience. And I always get thanked when I do that too. Like, hey, this is cool. Tell me about how you handle, not criticism, but differing opinions, because that's that moment you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on what mood I'm in. I think sometimes,
Me too.
Sometimes I'm just like in a big hurry. And so I just want to acknowledge, or maybe not even a big hurry. It might be that I'm in a hurry. It might also be that it's a topic that it doesn't make sense to me to really engage around because, we disagree, and that's okay. But I will say to them, thank you. I appreciate your weighing in, provided that it's thoughtful, right? Sometimes people put gobbledygook stuff where I just said it's a hater, and I don't feed that flame or fan that flame. To your point, there are times when someone genuinely disagrees and you think, never thought about that. Like that perspective hadn't occurred to me, at which point I will say, thank you. That happens when I have the time. and willing to make the time to do it. And also when it's a topic about which I actually care in a fairly meaningful way. One of the things I have found interesting, Josh, is on LinkedIn, one of the things that we do fairly frequently is we'll post quotes that we like.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that quotes are so powerful is that they distill some truth, but they tend to be fairly black and white. And so it's always interesting to me to hear people's responses to them, because sometimes people are like, yeah, I get it. Like they get the gist of it and they agree with it. And sometimes they vociferously disagree, like that's not right, because there's a duality that doesn't get captured. I also find it fascinating, and this is where the interesting perspective can come in, is when someone who for whom English is not their native tongue, and they read it, they interpret it very differently. And that's fascinating. They'll be like, well, what about this? And I'll think, oh yeah, I can see how they read those words that way. And so I realized at that point that there's all sorts of cultural context at play in reading that quote that I'm not aware of because English is my mother tongue.
Yeah. And I want to say, I have never been a huge fan of the motivational quotes and stuff on LinkedIn, but I love Whitney's quotes. And it really brought me to a conversation, and the conversations I've had with LinkedIn, where a few years ago, so many people were putting the wrong kind of motivational quotes and not appropriate business things on LinkedIn, that I think it goes back to LinkedIn this year wanted to celebrate Whitney's content, that because her quotes aren't just motivational, they're thought provoking. And I really appreciate that, that they are almost always relevant to something that I can relate to or challenge myself on. And I think that's what LinkedIn was trying to get to when a few years ago, they were like, guys, come on, we don't want like pictures of cats and stuff on here, you know, with motivational saying. We want really good content that challenges people to be better and brings value to their business day. And one of the reasons I first reached out to Whitney and said, hey, I'd love to have you on my show is because of that. Because I said, well, I've never had anybody whose quotes draw me in each day to really ponder them. So thank you for that. So where do you find your quotes while we're on the topic?
It's a great question. So I have a database of quotes that I've just collected over the years.
Yeah,
and,
I used to do that. It's hard to do. It's hard to keep up with, right?
It is hard to do. And then when I find a quote that I like, I put it in my spreadsheet. I read a fair amount of fiction, and I find that fiction ends up having some really fascinating quotes. And then I have a person that helps support me on social media, and occasionally she finds some quotes as well. So it's a combination of the two.
So tell me about, other than your quotes, I mentioned earlier, and a lot of folks who are kind of new to social media but have it as a priority, it's important to understand the different types of content on social media, particularly now that video in the last 2 years has become the type of content that all the platforms want to promote because they want us to come back so many times. I wrote a story a couple of years ago, Whitney, called, about a year and a half ago, I co-wrote it with somebody, called Video Killed a LinkedIn Star. Because LinkedIn, like myself, or like you, had asked me to write for them a couple of years ago on healthcare topics, and they would promote it, and I'd get 20,000 followers. And then one day I sent it to them, and 3 days later I had 300 views. I said, hey, what's going on? They said, oh, we got rid of our pulses, and we're not really promoting long form stories anymore. We're promoting video.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that
I had the same experience, by the way. I think
it's
like,
hard.
Okay, I just wrote this really good piece, and no one cares. Okay, I guess we're going to play by different rules now. Yeah.
And it challenges folks like us, particularly writers, because anybody can do a video, and that was really the point of the whole story, which is like anybody can do a video, but you know, you're going to have to be better as a writer now. But the point I wanted to make is I love short form posts, which means if Whitney or somebody else wrote a story and I read it and said, wow, great story, I want to share it with my following. And I'm going to put those 2 or 3 Josh Luke filter sentences on there that say, hey, read the whole thing, but man, here's the part that stood out to me that I really loved, which is how I've built my lane. I kind of, when I spoke at the Masters LinkedIn event, I said, hey, establish your street cred, which, you know, Whitney, you got a ton of street cred, you know, from all these books and social media growth and the Harvard, all that you have. So now that you have your street cred, okay, so develop your lane, which you've done such a great job of with disruption. And mine is disruption, but healthcare affordability and social media. People say, they'll stop me in the airport or when I'm speaking and go, hey, man, I just love when you put those 2 or 3 totally truthful, honest, transparent sentences. That's, and they said, I usually hear, I really like it when you kind of call them out and say, yeah, this is just a propaganda piece. I wouldn't buy into this. This is the part to read. So what's your favorite type of media is the question on social media. Is it short form, long form video, all of the above? Talk to us about that.
To produce or to ingest?
Either or, whichever.
Okay.
Is there one that you lean more to?
I mean, I love short form because it allows, I think part of what I like about short form is short form written is it allows you to start a conversation.
Yeah.
I've been experimenting with video a lot more. What's interesting is that it seems like the algorithm really likes video, but I don't always get the sense that people actually interact with video as much as they do with the written word, which is fascinating, right? Because it's like, do more video, but do you find that people actually interact with you when you're doing video as much as they do when you've just written something?
I think it's a great question. And what I've seen, and you've probably seen a couple of these posts too, where they go, do you know why this picture has 1 million followers? And it breaks down what's intriguing about the picture. And I'm like, well, I see more intriguing pictures than that every day, and they don't have 1 million views. So same security, but I agree with you. And I've been over the last 2 years since I met so many of these influencers at the Masters LinkedIn event, studying them. And I know several of them. I've never ever deleted a post because it didn't get enough interaction. I might have deleted it for other reasons. I have a ton of friends who if after 48 hours there's not a lot of likes and comments and shares, they delete their post because they think it hurts their chances of getting promoted through the algorithm, which I think is silly. But also that's just the way they think. And I don't think the algorithm even corresponds with that level of thinking.
I don't either.
A couple of years ago, maybe, but I don't think, they're changing it all the time. So I don't get as much interactivity on video because of the video. But I believe that a little short form post with the video, right? 2 or 3 sentences about, hey, and I for a while did a daily video minute, and I called it that on purpose because I wanted people to know short and to the point on healthcare affordability. But I would agree with you. I don't get as much activity on the video.
Yeah, so it's fascinating because it's anyway, it's an interesting question.
So let's talk. I know you have a very successful podcast. Are you still doing your podcast? And if so, what's the name of it?
Absolutely. It's called Disrupt Yourself Podcast.
Okay, Disrupt Yourself Podcast.
Yeah, and you can find it on my website if you go to whitneyjohnson.com.
Okay, yeah, thanks for mentioning the website. So the Disrupt Yourself Podcast. So here's a fun question. Putting you on the spot again, tell me your favorite guest you've ever interviewed, or 2 or 3 that you just go, wow, that was so fun.
Oh, yeah. So one that I'll just go with one that immediately comes to mind is, this was fairly early on. So I've been podcasting for about 2 years and 3 months. I started in September of 2016. And I think she was in the first 10, I interviewed Stacey London. And Stacey London, if you don't know who she is, she was on What Not to Wear. So, lots of women tend to know who she is. Okay. And so you would watch her show, and they would bring a person in, and they would come in for a makeover, and they, were dressed terribly, terrible makeup, terrible hair. And then they would have this intervention, and then have the person, change how they look. And it was very compelling for me. And so I had reached out to her, a little bit of a fangirl, and interviewed her. And I think that's one of my favorite podcasts, in part because it was, because I admire her and respect her, but also because I found that in that interview, I started to gain, kind of in my language, started to move up the S-curve of learning as an interviewer. I found myself that I was starting to hit my stride, that I wasn't just, here's my list of 10 questions and we're going to be done. It was, we were having this conversation, and it went in this place that was completely unexpected, almost turned into a live coaching session. It was a really powerful moment, again, because I admire her, because it was interesting, and because I started to feel that as an interviewer, I was really potentially adding value, not only to the audience, but to the person I was interviewing. And so that was a really exciting moment, and a hallmark moment for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you so much, Whitney, for coming on and talking social media. Let me put you on the spot about healthcare and affordability. I know not a topic that you spend a lot of time thinking about. I try to be true to this audience. There's a lot of brokers and benefits advisors, and also business owners and HR directors. And interestingly, as somebody who's one of the top executive coaches in the country, you one of the groups I target are those same executive teams to say, hey, there's only one expense in your whole business that you can't control, and it's healthcare. So as much as we want to build this team, when are we going to take accountability for controlling this one expense that's out of control? I mean, I always joke that, hey, once a year, your broker takes you to a nice steak dinner and then hands you an envelope that says, we're increasing your costs 8%. Oh, and here's the 2 benefits we're taking away this year. There's no other part of any business where there's just this hyperinflation that's out of control and people just kind of take it. So thank you so much. Whitney, tell everybody again, WhitneyJohnson.com.
Yeah.
On Twitter, @JohnsonWhitney.
Correct.
On LinkedIn, Whitney Johnson.
Oh, I think it's Whitney L. Johnson, but I'm not sure. If you just go into LinkedIn and do Whitney Johnson, you should be able to find it.
Awesome. And the Disrupt Yourself podcast. So
yes.
Awesome time, Whitney. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. And I look forward to continuing to follow you on social media.
Well, Josh, thank you very much for having me. It's a really intriguing and engaging subject. So best wishes as you continue on down this path.
Likewise. Dr. Josh Luke signing off from the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio show. Thanks to Whitney Johnson for joining the show.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show with Forbes author and contributor Dr. Josh Luke, America's Healthcare Affordability Authority. Visit drjoshluke.com for information on speaking appearances and other resources.